The castle has been awake for hours. Before the first hint of sunrise touches the stone walls, the kitchens are already alive with the sound of crackling fires, clattering wooden buckets, and the rhythmic thud of heavy churns. In the dim glow of tallow candles, dairymaids work in silence. Their hands ache from the cold. One woman grips the long wooden dasher and drives it up and down through a barrel of thick cream. Again, again, again. Nearly an hour passes before the liquid finally begins to change. Tiny golden grains appear. The room fills with a rich, sweet aroma. Butter. A steward steps forward without saying a word. He carefully weighs each fresh block before wrapping it in coarse linen. Some of it will be carried upstairs to the Lord's table, where roasted venison, warm bread, and fresh herbs await the morning meal. The rest is just as valuable. Packed into wooden barrels layered with salt, it will travel for weeks by wagon and ship, feeding monasteries, market towns, merchant crews crossing the North Sea, and soldiers marching toward distant battlefields. Outside the castle gates, however, another family is beginning the same day. A peasant woman kneels beside a single cow, her family's greatest possession. Every drop of milk matters. Some will become cheese that might last through winter. Some will feed her children tonight, and if there is enough cream left, she will churn butter. Not because it is a luxury, but because it may be the only way her family survives the months when fields freeze, harvests fail, and fresh food disappears. Today, butter seems almost ordinary. It melts onto toast, disappears into mashed potatoes, waits quietly in the refrigerator, rarely earning a second thought. But there was a time when this humble block of golden fat helped build kingdoms, sustained entire economies, challenged the authority of the church, and quite literally kept millions of Europeans alive. The history of medieval Europe is often told through kings, castles, and crusades, but hidden behind them all was something far smaller, a wooden churn, and the food it created. When historians describe the foundations of medieval Europe, they usually begin with familiar images: stone castles rising above the countryside, knights charging across muddy battlefields, monasteries preserving ancient knowledge behind thick walls, merchant ships carrying silk and spices from distant lands. Butter rarely appears in that story. It seems too ordinary, too humble, too domestic. And yet, for nearly 1,000 years, butter quietly accomplished something that armies, kings, and even governments could not. It fed Europe. Today, butter is often treated as an indulgence, a finishing touch spread over warm bread or melted into vegetables. Nutrition debates come and go. Some praise it as natural, others criticize its fat content. In supermarkets, it sits beside dozens of alternatives, easily replaced by margarine, vegetable oils, or countless other products. Its importance feels almost trivial. But remove butter from medieval Europe, and the continent begins to look remarkably different. Because for much of the Middle Ages, butter was far more than a food. It was a way of preserving precious calories through long winters. It was a source of concentrated energy for farmers working frozen fields from sunrise to sunset. It became a valuable trade commodity, connecting isolated villages with growing towns. In some regions, it served as rent paid to landlords, taxes owed to kings, and gifts exchanged to secure alliances. Monasteries depended on it, armies marched with it, families survived because of it. The irony is striking. The foods that dominate history books, pepper, cinnamon, sugar, and silk, were luxuries enjoyed by the few. Butter belonged to almost everyone. Precisely because it was so common, history learned to overlook it. But there was another contradiction, one even stranger. While butter sustained millions across Northern Europe, much of medieval Christianity regarded it with suspicion. In large parts of Catholic Europe, eating animal fat during periods of fasting was forbidden. Olive oil was the preferred choice. Yet in the cold climates north of the Alps, olive trees simply could not grow. Entire communities found themselves caught between religious devotion and practical survival. Could a farmer plowing frozen fields really live without butter? Could a monastery feed hundreds of monks through winter using an ingredient that barely existed in their climate? The answer would reshape medieval religion, fill church treasuries, and even help finance some of Europe's greatest cathedrals. To understand how something as ordinary as butter became powerful enough to influence both kingdoms and the church, we have to begin thousands of years earlier, long before there were castles, before there was medieval Europe, before anyone had ever churned cream into gold. No one knows who made the first butter. There is no king's decree announcing its invention. No ancient monument celebrates its creator. No forgotten scroll records the exact moment when milk became something entirely new. It was almost certainly an accident. Imagine a group of herders crossing the vast grasslands of Central Asia nearly 7,000 years ago. Their wealth was measured not in gold, but in animals, cattle, sheep, goats, and perhaps most importantly, horses. Life was never still. Families moved with the seasons, following fresh pasture and reliable water. Every possession had to be light enough to carry, every food durable enough to survive long journeys. Fresh milk was both a blessing and a problem. It spoiled quickly. Without refrigeration, warm temperatures transformed it within hours. For a nomadic family, wasting milk meant wasting one of the most valuable resources they possessed. So they stored it in leather bags made from animal skins and tied them to the sides of wagons or saddles. Hour after hour, day after day, the bags swung back and forth with every step of the journey. Inside, something remarkable was happening. The constant motion churned the cream, separating tiny droplets of fat from the liquid beneath. By the time the travelers stopped to make camp, the milk had transformed into soft yellow clumps floating in thin buttermilk. Without intending to, they had discovered one of humanity's oldest food technologies. Archaeology suggests this transformation happened astonishingly early. Chemical analyses of ancient pottery from Europe and the Near East reveal traces of milk fats dating back thousands of years, while evidence of dairying appears soon after humans domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats. Although butter itself rarely survives in the archaeological record, the tools used to process milk and the residues left behind tell a compelling story. But butter was more than a happy accident. It solved a problem that had troubled every early farming community. Milk was fragile. Butter was resilient. By removing much of the water from cream, people created a food that lasted far longer than fresh milk. Add salt and it could survive weeks, or even months, under the right conditions. At a time when every season carried the threat of famine, that difference could mean the difference between life and death. Different cultures quickly gave butter different meanings. In ancient Mesopotamia, dairy products became part of temple economies, recorded on clay tablets alongside grain and livestock. Egyptian tomb paintings show scenes of milking cattle, though butter never became as central there as it would farther north. Across the colder regions of Europe, however, where olive trees could not flourish and animal husbandry shaped everyday life, butter began to earn a place not just on the table, but at the center of survival. It provided concentrated energy for people whose lives demanded relentless physical labor. It preserved the nutritional value of milk long after fresh milk had spoiled. And perhaps most importantly, it turned a daily surplus into a dependable reserve against an uncertain future. What began as an accident inside a swaying leather bag would eventually feed monasteries, finance trade, and help sustain an entire civilization. But before butter could build medieval Europe, Europe itself first had to learn how to depend on it. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, Europe did not simply lose an empire. It lost the complex trade networks that had supplied cities with food from across the Mediterranean. Roads fell into disrepair. Long-distance commerce shrank. Many urban centers emptied as populations returned to the countryside, where survival depended less on markets than on whatever families could grow, raise, or preserve themselves. Life became intensely local. And in Northern Europe, that changed everything people ate. Unlike the warm Mediterranean, where olive trees flourished and olive oil dominated the kitchen, much of Northern Europe was simply too cold for olives to grow. From Ireland and Scotland to Scandinavia, Northern Germany and the Low Countries, winters were long, damp and unforgiving. The land favored grass. Grass fed cattle. And cattle produced milk. What began as a geographical reality gradually became an entire way of life. Across the countryside, the rhythm of the year revolved around the dairy season. As spring returned and fresh pasture spread across the hills, cows produced more milk than families could drink. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, so every household faced the same question: how could today's abundance become tomorrow's survival? The answer echoed from cottages across Europe: the steady rhythm of the butter churn. For hours at a time, women worked heavy wooden churns, transforming cream into something that could last far longer than milk ever could. It was exhausting labor. Historical accounts and later rural traditions describe butter making as one of the most physically demanding household tasks, often requiring continuous churning until the fat finally separated. It was work that demanded patience more than strength. And it was almost always women's work. Generation after generation, mothers taught daughters how to judge cream by its smell, how long to churn in different seasons, how cold the water should be when washing fresh butter, and exactly how much salt was needed to preserve it through the coming winter. Few of these women ever appeared in chronicles or royal records, yet they were producing one of medieval Europe's most essential foods. Butter became concentrated security. Unlike fresh milk, it could be stored. Unlike grain, it required no milling. Unlike meat, it did not depend on slaughtering valuable livestock. Every successful batch represented calories saved for another day. Those calories mattered. The average medieval peasant performed astonishing amounts of physical labor. Fields were plowed by hand or with simple animal-drawn tools. Forests were cleared with axes. Firewood was carried over long distances. Water was hauled in buckets. During harvest, entire families worked from dawn until darkness, often surviving on little more than coarse bread, pottage, cheese, and whatever dairy products they could produce. Butter provided something their diets desperately needed: dense energy. Just a small amount could transform a simple meal into one capable of sustaining hours of exhausting work. Spread over dark rye bread, stirred into porridge, or melted over root vegetables, it delivered calories that were difficult to obtain elsewhere during the cold months. As medieval populations grew, butter began moving beyond the household. Village markets filled with carefully wrapped rolls of butter, each reflecting the quality of local pastures and the skill of the dairy woman who had made it. Merchants purchased surplus production and carried it toward expanding towns, monasteries, and castles where demand continued to rise. In Ireland, butter became so valuable that families sometimes buried it in peat bogs to preserve it for months or even years. Archaeologists have uncovered these remarkable deposits, known today as bog butter, some dating back more than 1,000 years. Protected from air, light, and bacteria by the cool, acidic peat, the butter survived in astonishing condition. To modernize, hiding food underground may seem strange. To medieval families, it was an investment. A reserve against famine, a safeguard against failed harvests. A form of wealth that could literally be unearthed when times grew desperate. By the High Middle Ages, butter had become more than nourishment. It was entering the economy itself. Landlords accepted dairy products as part of rents. Monasteries managed large herds whose butter fed both monks and travelers. Merchants began transporting salted butter across the North Sea, linking rural farms with distant ports. Entire regions, particularly in Ireland, Flanders, and Scandinavia, developed reputations for producing butter of exceptional quality. A food born from necessity was quietly becoming an engine of commerce. But just as butter reached the height of its importance, it encountered an obstacle no farmer could churn away. Not disease, not famine, not war. The greatest challenge to butter's future would come from one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe: the Church. For a food so ordinary, butter found itself at the center of an extraordinary conflict. Not between kingdoms, not between armies, but between survival and salvation. By the High Middle Ages, Christianity shaped nearly every aspect of European life. The Church was not simply a religious institution. It influenced politics, education, law, agriculture, and even the meals people placed on their tables. Among its many traditions was the practice of fasting. For well over 100 days each year, including Lent, Advent, Fridays, and numerous feast days, devout Christians were expected to abstain from foods considered too rich or luxurious. Meat was forbidden. Animal fats were largely prohibited. Butter fell into the same category. The rule reflected both spiritual discipline and biblical tradition. Denying oneself rich foods was believed to strengthen the soul, reminding believers that earthly pleasures should never outweigh devotion to God. In theory, the rule applied to everyone. In practice, Europe faced a problem that Rome never had: geography. Around the Mediterranean, fasting posed relatively few difficulties. Olive trees flourished beneath warm skies, providing a plentiful source of olive oil for cooking. Fish were abundant along the coast, and the climate supported crops unknown in colder northern lands. North of the Alps, however, life looked very different. Winter lasted longer. Fields produced fewer vegetables. Olive trees could not survive. For millions of people, butter was not a luxury replacing olive oil. It was the only cooking fat they had. Imagine a farming family in 14th century Norway. Outside, snow has buried the fields for months. The river is frozen. Fresh vegetables disappeared long ago. Inside their small wooden house, nearly every meal depends on grain, dried fish, and the butter carefully churned and salted during the brief summer months. Now imagine being told that for weeks at a time, you cannot eat it. The command may have been spiritually meaningful, but it was physically difficult. Across Northern Europe, ordinary people faced an impossible choice: honor religious law or eat the food that kept them alive through winter. The contradiction became so widespread that even church leaders recognized the problem. And so began one of the most fascinating compromises in medieval history. Rather than abolishing the fasting rules, the church created exceptions. Communities, monasteries, noble families, and even entire regions could petition bishops, or, in some cases, the Pope himself, for permission to consume butter during fasting periods. These permissions were known as butter dispensations. They were not always free. In many cases, those requesting permission made financial contributions to the church in return. What had begun as a religious restriction gradually became an unexpected source of revenue. Perhaps nowhere is this connection more famous than in Rouen, France. According to long-standing historical tradition, money collected from butter dispensations helped finance the construction of a magnificent tower attached to Rouen Cathedral. Over time, it became popularly known as La Tour de Beurre, the butter tower. Whether every stone can be traced directly to butter payments is still debated by historians, but the nickname itself reveals something remarkable. A humble dairy product had become linked with one of Europe's grandest religious monuments. It was an irony few medieval theologians could have predicted. The very food once discouraged during holy seasons was now helping fund the church itself. Meanwhile, monasteries became some of Europe's greatest butter producers. Many religious communities managed extensive farmland and dairy herds. Monks and nuns refined techniques for breeding cattle, improving pasture, and preserving butter with salt. Surplus production supplied nearby towns, welcomed pilgrims, and generated income that supported hospitals, schools, and charitable work. Faith and farming, once seemingly at odds, gradually found common ground. By the late Middle Ages, butter had shed much of its earlier reputation as an indulgence in Northern Europe. It had become accepted as a practical necessity deeply woven into everyday life. Yet its influence was about to extend far beyond village kitchens and monastery cellars. Because as European trade expanded across the seas, butter would become more than a staple of survival. It would become a commodity, one that merchants fought to transport, cities competed to control, and entire nations learned to profit from. For thousands of years, butter belonged to the people who made it. Its flavor changed from farm to farm. Its color shifted with the seasons, growing pale during winter and deep golden when cows grazed on fresh summer grass. Every village had its own methods, its own traditions, and its own understanding of what good butter should taste like. Then the Industrial Revolution changed everything. The transformation did not begin in the kitchen, it began on the railway. During the 19th century, Europe was becoming more connected than ever before. Railroads linked remote farming communities to rapidly growing cities. Steamships crossed the North Sea with unprecedented speed. What had once taken weeks now took days. For the first time, butter could travel hundreds of miles before spoiling. Demand exploded. Cities like London, Paris, and Berlin were growing at extraordinary rates. Millions of factory workers no longer produced their own food. Instead, they relied on distant farms to feed them. Butter, once churned for a single household, had become a product for entire nations. The old wooden churns were no longer enough. New machines transformed dairying into an industry. The invention of the centrifugal cream separator in the late 19th century allowed farmers to separate cream from milk in minutes instead of waiting hours for it to rise naturally. Mechanical churns replaced exhausting manual labor, producing larger quantities with far greater consistency. Refrigerated railcars and cold storage warehouses extended butter's reach even further, allowing it to cross countries and eventually oceans. For countless rural families, this was both an opportunity and a disruption. Some prospered. Cooperative dairies emerged across Denmark, the Netherlands, and Ireland, where small farmers pooled their milk, invested in modern equipment, and sold butter under trusted regional brands. Danish butter, in particular, earned an international reputation for quality, becoming one of Europe's most successful agricultural exports. Others struggled. Large industrial producers could manufacture butter faster, cheaper, and more consistently than individual households. Skills that had passed from mother to daughter for centuries gradually gave way to standardized production lines and commercial dairy factories. The butter itself became more uniform. But something else was quietly disappearing: the intimate connection between the people who made food and the people who ate it. Then, just as butter reached the height of its industrial success, a new rival appeared. In 1869, a French chemist named Hippolyte Mege-Morier developed margarine, originally intended as an inexpensive alternative to butter. Governments welcomed it. Urban workers could afford it. During the shortages of the two world wars, millions of families relied on it when butter was scarce or rationed. For the first time in thousands of years, butter was no longer the undisputed king of the table. Yet despite competition from margarine and later vegetable oils, butter never disappeared. Because people had not simply grown accustomed to its taste, they had spent nearly 7,000 years building their civilizations around it. And some traditions prove far more durable than technology alone. The 20th century predicted butter's downfall more than once. Doctors warned against saturated fat. Governments promoted margarine. Food companies introduced vegetable oils advertised as cleaner, healthier, and more modern. Supermarket shelves filled with substitutes promising longer shelf lives, lower prices, and scientific nutrition. For a while, it seemed as though butter's 7,000-year reign was coming to an end. Consumption declined across much of Europe and North America. Families that had spread butter on bread for generations began reaching instead for plastic tubs filled with something entirely new. History, it seemed, had finally moved on. But history has a habit of surprising us. As nutrition science became more sophisticated, researchers began questioning many of the broad assumptions that had shaped dietary advice for decades. While debates about saturated fat continue, scientists also recognized that whole foods are far more complex than simple labels like good or bad. Butter, once dismissed as little more than unhealthy fat, gradually returned to kitchens, not as an everyday necessity for survival, but as an ingredient valued for its flavor, craftsmanship, and connection to tradition. At the same time, another movement was quietly taking shape. People wanted to know where their food came from again. Small dairies reopened. Artisan butter makers revived techniques that had nearly disappeared during the industrial age. Cows returned to open pastures. Cream was cultured before churning, just as it had been in parts of Europe for centuries. Regional butters from Normandy, Ireland, Denmark, and the Alps became celebrated not simply as ingredients, but as expressions of local landscapes and centuries-old knowledge. The irony is remarkable. Technology transformed butter. Industry mass-produced it. Science questioned it. Yet none of those forces erased it. Because butter had never survived on convenience alone. It survived because it carried something that could not be manufactured in a factory or replaced by chemistry. Memory. Every culture has foods that taste like home. Warm bread shared around a family table. Potatoes finished with a melting pat of butter. A grandmother's pastry. A holiday feast. For millions of people, butter is more than an ingredient. It is a connection stretching back through generations, to farmers, monks, dairymaids, and families who discovered long ago that preserving cream meant preserving life itself. And perhaps that is why, after thousands of years, the oldest spread on the table still feels timeless. Imagine returning to that medieval castle one last time. The kitchen is quiet now. The fires have burned low. The great wooden churn stands in the corner, worn smooth by generations of hands that no history book ever recorded. The dairymaid has long been forgotten. The peasant woman outside the castle gates has no monument. The monks who salted butter in cool stone cellars are remembered only in scattered manuscripts. Yet their work lives on. Tomorrow morning, millions of people around the world will slice a piece of bread and spread butter across its surface without giving it a second thought. It will melt in seconds. The moment will seem utterly ordinary. But that small golden layer carries one of the longest stories ever told by a single food. It tells of nomads crossing the windswept grasslands of Eurasia, unknowingly discovering a way to preserve milk. It tells of medieval women whose daily labor quietly sustained entire villages through harsh winters. It tells of monasteries that refined the craft, merchants who carried barrels across stormy seas, and farmers whose cattle transformed the green fields of northern Europe into one of history's greatest sources of nourishment. It even tells of cathedrals whose stones were, in part, paid for by a food once considered too rich to eat during holy days. Butter never conquered an empire. It never wore a crown. It never commanded an army. Yet it accomplished something far more enduring. It kept ordinary people alive long enough to build the world around them. Perhaps that is why history so often overlooks it. The greatest forces that shape civilization are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are found in the quiet rhythm of a wooden churn, or in the simple piece of butter melting into a slice of warm bread. And perhaps the next time you watch it disappear, you'll remember that you are tasting far more than butter. You are tasting thousands of years of human resilience, ingenuity, and survival.